Hi, friends. We are just about at the end of Chains. We're going to have read just the last two chapters, 44 and 45. And if you remember at the end of 43, she's decided to get out of there, get away from the Lockdons, and she forged an official paper that she stole from Colonel Hawkins, stating that she, Isabel Gardner, being a free Negro, has the commandment's permission to pass from this garrison to whatever place she may think proper. So she has official paper, although it is forged. And where is she going to go? Let's find out. Chapter 44, this is a quote from Thomas Jefferson about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. That the question was not whether, by a Declaration of Independence, we should make ourselves what we are not, but whether we should declare a fact which already exists. And we are at Saturday, January 18th, 1777. I folded the map and pass, blew out the candles, and crept down the stairs. I took the scissors out of the sewing basket in the kitchen and snipped the threads of the hem on my cloak. I opened the map flat, inserted it between the lining and the woolen layer, then quick resewed the hem. Next, I dressed myself in all of my clothing, 2 shifts and 2 skirts, my cloak, shawl, and the blanket for my pallet. I took a basket from a high shelf and loaded it with bread, hard cheese, and a piece of dried beef I cut from the slab that hung in the pantry. As I put the beef back, I studied the loose board in the back of the pantry. I pried it up and removed the lead piece from the king's statue and my cloth packet of seeds. After some consideration, I took out common sense too and stuck all of it in the pocket I wore under my skirt, alongside the false pass. I walked down the hall, reached for the handle of the front door, and stopped. Lady Seymour lay in the silent parlor. I doubted anyone had thought to put wood on the fire for her. That was my chore. No, not any more. I was quit of this place. I reached again for the handle, but she was alone, old, and maybe freezing. It would take only a minute. I stepped into the parlor. Lady Seymour lay in her bed, her eyes closed, the covers barely moving. Her fire was nearly burned down to ash. I quick added logs and blew on the coals until small flames jumped up and bit into the wood. She wouldn't die of the cold this night, not on my account. I was halfway to the door when I saw her silk reticule hung from the back of a chair. There were coins in that bag, coins that would help a girl set on walking to South Carolina. But that was stealing from somebody who had showed me kindness. But she stood by when Ruth was taken, and she returned me to Madame. Taking her money was still stealing. 'Twas wrong, but I swallowed hard, opened the bag, and removed the coin purse from the bottom. When I hung it back on the chair, Lady Seymour's eyes were open and following me. The question on her face was plain. I'm sorry, I said. She's made up her mind to sell me. She nodded once. I built up the fire. Would you like some water? She nodded again. I poured a cup of water from the pitcher and held it to her dry lips. She swallowed a little, but the rest spilled down her face. I set down the cup and wiped away the water. I have to go. Please forgive me. Lady Seymour cut her eyes at her husband's small portrait on the bedside table, then to the coin purse that weighed down my hand. She gave a sharp nod of the head, one side of her mouth turned up in a smile. I'll put the money back, I said. Forgive me. She shook her head from side to side, her mouth moving with trapped words. I can keep it. Another nod and another pointed stare at her husband. Because I rescued his picture? She nodded again, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Well then, ma'am, I'm happy to take it. As I set the coin purse in my pocket, she opened her mouth and a small sound escaped. Did you say something, Lady Seymour? I leaned in close, though it scared me, for the smell of death hung over that bed like a fog. Her lips moved again, forming her last word to me, a whisper almost too faint to hear. Run. I opened the front door of the Lockton mansion and looked up the street and down, not a soul in sight. I picked up the basket, tightened the blanket across my shoulders, and stepped over the threshold. I closed the door behind me, walked down the front steps, and turned west. My plan was simple and foolhardy. Steal a rowboat, cross the river to Jersey, and walk to Charleston. I was counting on the commotion of the Queen's Ball to distract folks. If I could get to the boat in time, the tide would help pull me away from New York. At the first corner, my feet stopped. This was where I turned north most mornings to head up to the Bridewell. I urged my feet west toward the wharf. They did not listen. My remembrance called up the feel of being locked in the stocks, of my face being burnt, of him watching me from across the courtyard, him watching out for me. 'Twas Curzon who made sure I survived. 'Twas he who had been my steadfast friend since the day they brought me here. I couldn't. It would be hard enough to sneak past 2 armies and not get stolen again by someone who'd tear up my pass. And I didn't even have a pass for him. How to explain that? No, I couldn't. I looked west, toward the river, then north, then west again. No, not couldn't. I shouldn't. But I had to. I had a debt to pay. Good evening, sir, I said, holding out my basket to the huge soldier, Fisher, who opened the door to the Bridewell guardhouse. Fisher grunted and yawned. What's your business here? I'm going on midnight. It's going on midnight. I prayed that the Lord and Mama would forgive the river of lies about to flow from my mouth. Colonel Hawkins sent me, sir, to clean the cells, as you suggested. The guard stepped inside, and I followed him. He sat heavily in a chair and drank from a mug on the table. Terrible late to be cleaning cells. The colonel got wind of a prison inspector arriving. Nobody told me, he growled. I swallowed hard, but they don't tell me nothing. What's in the basket? He's dying. Hold on. Drat. Pause. There's probably a way to pause this, but I don't know what it is. Let me see if I can pause this. I can't. Great, quick little intermission, and we're back. Battery's not gonna die. Where was I? All right, she's giving the basket to Fisher and lying and saying that she's been rented out to clean the cells overnight. The colonel got wind of a prison inspector arriving. Nobody told me, he growled. I swallowed hard. Should I flee and give up on this senseless plot? He spat into the fire. But they don't tell me nothing. What's in the basket? Food to keep me alive for a week, I thought. Help yourself, I said. He pawed through it, took out a soft roll, and stuffed half of it in his mouth. Maybe I should ask the colonel. I thought quick as I could. Yes, sir, of course. He's at the Queen's ball. Fisher winced. Best not disturb that, all right. Best not disturb that. All right. He stood slow and reached for the key ring and a lantern on the wall. But don't be asking me to help. Cleaning the cells ain't my job. I took the key. Yes, sir. Wheelbarrow's in the hall, he said. Once you've filled it, roll it back here, and I'll let you out so as you can throw the muck and filth in the pit. He yawned. Mind your breathing. I turned. Pardon? Prisoners been dropped dead like flies. Fever. The men in the first cell were mostly sleeping or dying or dead. None of them had the strength to do more than stare at me in the weak lantern light. I gagged and gagged again as I carried out overflowing chamber pots and forced myself to take a blanket from a corpse. Hurry, I screamed inside. Hurry, or it will be too late. Fisher. Hold on, Yenny, I'm recording chains. Oh. I'll be right there. Intermission number 2. Hurry, I screamed inside. Hurry, or it will be too late. Fisher looked up and chuckled as I passed through the guardhouse with the barrow. I pitched the filth into the pit behind the prison and prayed it was not going atop any corpses. Before I went back inside, I cleaned off my hands in a snowbank. My teeth rattled with the cold. No fun, is it? The guard asked as I passed through again. He pulled at the blanket around his shoulders. Hurry up now, I need me sleep. Yes, sir. I wiped my hands on my skirt. Almost done, sir. I did not open the door to the second cell, nor the third. I set the lantern in the wheelbarrow, pushed it down the hall to the fourth door on the right, and held my breath as I unlocked it. The stench was overpowering, men unwashed for months in puke and muck and rot that was eating living flesh. 24 pairs of eyes watched me, burning in skull-like faces. No one spoke. I stepped inside and held the lantern higher. The faces were new to me, men and boys who had been moved in here after Curzon's original companions died. "Where's Mr. Dibdin?" I asked in a small voice. "Died this morning," croaked a man. "Everyone's dying." "What about the slave boy?" He pointed to a corner. Curzon lay insensible, his skin burning with fever, his eyes rolled up into his head. I called his name and pinched him, but he did not look my way, nor speak a word. "He'll be soon dead. Leave him and run." A weight settled on my shoulders like a cloak of iron. I bent close to his ear. "Shh," I whispered. A blast of cannon fire sounded from the battery, more royal celebrations. A few men looked to the window. "He's dead." I stood up. "Can someone help me with the body?" No one moved. "Then I shall do it myself." I grabbed Curzon under his armpits and dragged him across the floor and out the door. It took no effort at all to load him into the wheelbarrow. He weighed hardly more than a large sack of potatoes or a full butter churn. I dashed back into the cell, snatched his hat out of the shaking hands of a man who was putting it on his own head, grabbed the lantern, and closed and locked the cell door. I could not ponder the fate of the rest of the men. Some things were not to be borne. Before I pushed him down the hall and into the guardhouse, I covered Curzon with the filthy blanket I'd stolen from the first cell. "You're dead," I hissed to him. "No noise." In the guardhouse, Fisher was sitting on his bed, leaning against the wall and snoring. He roused some as I shut the door to the cells. "Got a nasty load here," I said. "Might take a bit to bury it." He nodded, already half asleep. As I pushed the wheelbarrow into the night, my legs shook so hard I thought sure they'd set the earth to trembling and bring the whole building crashing to the ground. What is this, 45? This is a quote from Thomas Paine from his Common Sense pamphlet. "Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part." The prison was 10 blocks from the wharf. I covered the first 8 blocks as fast as a girl pushing a near-dead lump of boy could. Then I stopped. A sentry fire was lit at the corner, burning between us and the last 2 blocks to the wharf. 6 British guards stood warming their hands, their muskets leaning against the small pile of firewood. A dog lay at their feet, head resting on its front paws. One of the men stretched his arm over his head and gave a mighty yawn, and his companions laughed at him. The dog lifted his head once and looked in our direction, but a soldier reached down to scratch his ears, and he relaxed. If I tried to push the wheelbarrow over the cobblestones, we'd be arrested in an instant. If it were half an hour earlier, we could have tracked backward and gone down another street, but the tide wouldn't wait. I backed up as slow as I could, cringing with every creak of the wheels. Once we were well out of sight of the men, I pulled the blanket off Curzon. "Get up," I whispered as I helped him from the barrow. "We need to get past those soldiers. After that, it's only 2 blocks to the river." "Boat?" he asked, leaning against a wall. "Of course. Follow me. Stay close." He took one step forward and collapsed against me, the 2 of us crumpling to the ground. "No," I scolded as I stood and pulled him to his feet. "You have to try harder." "Sorry, country," he muttered. He was not strong enough to walk on his own. I was not strong enough to carry him on my back, not after pushing him so far. I pulled his arm across my shoulder and had him lean on me heavily. "Step quiet," I whispered as we drew close to the corner again. 20 paces of open street separated us from the shadows on the other side. One of the soldiers walked to the woodpile, picked up a split log, carried it to the fire, and tossed it on the flames. For the moment, all the men had their backs to us. "Ready?" I said in Curzon's ear. He nodded. I drew a deep breath and we started to walk, soft as we could. 20 paces stretched to 20 miles, every faint crunch of our shoes sounding like gunshot. 5 steps, I counted silently. 6, 7. Curzon had little strength in his legs. He faltered and almost fell again. I wrapped my other arm around him and clutched his shirt. 8, 9, 10. The dog lifted his head. He stared right at me and barked. One of the soldiers startled, shouting, "Look at that," and pointed to the sky. The heavens exploded into the red glare of rockets and white fountains of light. Curzon and I stood as if planted, amazed at the sight of the fireworks being shot off in honor of Queen Charlotte. The dog barked furiously in our direction, but the soldiers were all staring at the illuminations above. The noise rolled up, booms that sounded like thunder and cannons. The men all smiled and laughed at the spectacle. I dragged Curzon across the street and down the last 2 blocks to the wharf. It was dark, no watch posted as I had hoped. Thank you, Mama, I muttered as we crawled into a rowboat. Curzon groaned. What you say? I untied us from the wharf. Never mind. But he was already insensible again. I picked up the oars. I rode that river. I rode that river like it was a horse delivering me from the devil. My hands blistered, the blisters popped, they reformed and popped again. I rode my hands slick with blood, my back, my shoulders, my arms. They pulled with the strength of 1,000 armloads of firewood split and carried, of water buckets toted for miles, of the burdens of every New York day and New York night boiled into 2 miles of water that I was going to cross. Set after set of the Queen's fireworks exploded over the roofs of the city, over Canvastown, over the mansions that held the king's subjects in their ball gowns and fancy dress uniforms. Her fireworks blasted off, and everybody gazed into the sky, and I rode and rode and rode past their homes, aside their warehouses, underneath their cannons, and out into the open harbor, betwixt New York Island and Jersey. My wits wandered some, about the time my hands started bleeding. Tongues of fog oozed across the water and curled around the bits of ice that floated past. I saw in the fog the forms of people. They never came close enough that I could see their faces. Once I reached out, feeling a warm presence, but I near tipped the boat over and had to grab for the oar before it slid away. My hands plunged into the icy water and I rode, but it didn't hurt after that because my hands had froze. I rose and the tide pulled, and the ghosts, who could indeed travel over water, tugged my boat with all their strength. My eyes closed and the moon drew west, away from the island of my melancholy. When my eyes opened, I knew I had died and passed on to glory. Heaven was crystal lit with white angel fire, colored peach at the edges. Heaven smelled of wood smoke. I blinked. The Bible did not mention that heaven smelled of wood smoke. I blinked again. When I opened my eyes, they watered because of the bright morning light. The rowboat had come ashore in a tangle of bushes that overhung a small bank at the side of the river. The branches overhead were all coated in ice. I was coated in ice too. That fractured and crackled as I moved. I looked to the water, then to the rising sun, then to the water again. I looked around me. No houses, no ships, no wharves. The river was narrow and flowing out to sea, south. The sun rose beyond the water at the other side of the river. I was on the west bank. I was in Jersey. I had set myself free. I wiped at the water that flowed down my cheeks and kicked at the stinking bundle at the bottom of the boat. You alive? I asked. The bundle groaned and pushed aside the shredded blanket. Curzon lifted his head enough to look at me sitting there with a fool grin on my face. Where are we? He asked in a thin voice. I think we just crossed the River Jordan. I stood up, steadied myself as the boat rocked a bit, and offered him my hand. Can you walk? All right, that was the end of Ashes. Next in the series, the second of 3 books, is Forge. And it continues the story of Isabel and Curzon, but from the perspective of Curzon rather than Isabel. So I hope you'll read it with me. Poster, we learned that when there were runaway slaves, their masters oftentimes posted advertisements with like rewards for people if anyone returned them. So this one reads, Runaways. Notice to readers, one and all be hereby advised that the account of Runaways, Isabel Gardner, formerly Sal Lockton, and companion Curzon Bellingham, will be continued in the forthcoming volume, Forge. Okay, I see what they did there. That was an advertisement for us for the next book, but I'm sure Madame Lockton will be also posting a real advertisement. All right, let's talk about these chapters and then move on to Forge. Thank you for listening. I look forward to discussing them with you and getting into Forge.